Welcome back everyone. Let's go ahead and talk about none other than the iPad Air 3 and see how this bad boy holds up in 2021. Now starting off, I can definitely tell you this iPad is still completely worth it. There are so many great things going on with this iPad and it's not even that old. It just came out in 2019, but we have gotten a couple improvements. We've gotten, the next iteration of this iPad, which is the iPad Air 4. We've gotten iPad Pros, and there should be some new iPad Pros coming out now, making the older iPads go down in value in the used market a little bit. So I'll leave the iPad Air 3 and some other iPads that I, kind of recommend throughout this year linked down below. You can get them from there and help support the channel at the same time. Now starting off with the front of the iPad Air 3, we did have that 10.5-inch IPS panel on the front, and it had a crazy good resolution, 1668 by 2224, and it was pretty much in the same body as the iPad Pro 2nd generation. It had almost the exact same everything around it in terms of the external. The only downside is we didn't get that 120 Hz transferred over. So this iPad, even though it's newer than the iPad Pro 2nd gen, it did not have that 120 Hz. So that does kind of suck a little bit, but again, there's really not much we can do about it. But I still think this iPad really doesn't even look that bad, even though it still has a home button and everything. The bezel around the display isn't even that bad, and I actually do think it's a pretty big asset for it. It still looks really good. It doesn't look super old or outdated, but as I mentioned before, if we had something like the iPad Air 4 type of design, that would have been way better. But this one doesn't really look that bad either, so I can't really blame Apple for, making the decision that they did. It came out in 2019, so it's like totally okay. Now we do have the Lightning port as well as a, headphone jack on this device as well, so I'm glad Apple kept that in here. And on the back, we don't really have anything super crazy, just the standard Apple logo, single camera setup, and then that aluminum build as well. Now feeling in the hand, this iPad is definitely a big device. It's not a small one. I can't one-hand it comfortably. Obviously I can't one-hand it, but I can't use it with one hand. I have to kind of use two hands at one time, one to hold, one to kind of mess around with. If you like a smaller iPad, the iPad minis are the way to go, but this iPad, for the size and the feeling in the hand, it still feels like a really good size, but on top of that, it still feels extremely premium. These iPads, Apple has never made a cheap iPad. There's a lot of other manufacturers there that have made, cheaper products, but this iPad feels so good in the hand, it doesn't feel cheap. And when I feel my iPad Pros and I feel my iPad Airs, they feel almost exactly the same. The only difference is, the flat sides. But now that we got the iPad Air 4, there's a little bit less, there's a little bit more improvement there, but this iPad still feels extremely good too. So in terms of that, it definitely feels really good in the hands. Now moving on to the camera sides of things, like I mentioned, the iPad Air 4 does have that single camera setup on the back. It's an 8 megapixel sensor and it's a 1080p lens basically. So you can really only do 1080p videos on it, and that is kind of a bigger problem if I would say, because it's just kind of one of those things where, of course, nobody's really shooting like crazy big or high intensive videos on their specific iPads, but it would have been nice had we had a little bit of an improvement on this camera setup. I think the iPad Pro 2nd gen had a pretty decent camera. This thing almost shares the same exact back camera as the iPad Air 2, if I remember correctly. So it's really not, you're not doing 4K or anything like that on this camera, but if you're doing Zoom calls, Google Meets, Microsoft Teams, whatever those type of, video platform things, FaceTime calls, whatever you're going to do, you're probably going to be okay. There's not really going to be too big of a problem, but that's for the back camera. The front camera is also pretty much the same. You have a 7 megapixel front facing camera, and you can do 1080p on the front as well, thankfully. Now no 4K at 60, no 1080p at 60, just standard 1080p at 30. And as I mentioned, I think it's totally fine. I'm totally okay with this. But again, compared to what we have nowadays, with even our iPhones having such great cameras on the front, I don't really see too many people citing for picking up their iPad Air to pick up these calls when they can just do it on their phone and get way better picture quality and just get way better image quality from their specific device, from their pocket, rather than picking up an iPad. So that's the one issue where this iPad kind of is a little bit more or less relevant, I would say, especially since we've all been working from home and stuff. The picture quality is going to be great and all that stuff still, but it's just sad that our iPhones have better quality than these iPads that came out the same year as the phone. So take it as you will, but that's pretty much how it kind of sum up the camera quality of this specific device in 2021. Now moving on to, as I always say, this is the best thing about these iPads, the specific software and the battery life. So first of all, with the software, this This thing started off with iOS 12.1.3. It did get upgradable to iOS 14 right now, so we're on 14.4.1 or whatever it is, and this thing is going to be lasting for a couple more years for sure at least. This thing's lifespan is going to be insane, and to give you some perspective, this thing has pretty much the same chipset inside of it as the iPhone XR and XS and XS Max, and those things feel like they just came out, right? So those things are probably going to be getting updates for quite a bit of time. I mean, the iPhone 6s, the iPhone 7, iPhone 8 are also supported, and those phones came out before the iPhone XS. So I'm not really 100% too sure what's going to be happening, but I would say at least like another 3 years this thing's going to be getting updates. So this thing's going to be lasting for quite a bit of time in that. So that's a really cool advantage there. But on the other side, this thing also has an 8,134 mAh battery. And as I mentioned before, that is a massive size battery to have on this type of iPad. It does have a higher resolution display, and it definitely is, a little bit more power heavy, but that's still not like a small size battery for this type of device. So you're definitely going to be lasting for quite a bit of time on this specific iPad. And as I mentioned, if you're a student, if you're somebody who needs to take this iPad from you to one class to the other, if you need something to kind of, be a substitute for your laptop sometimes, this iPad is, the best thing about it besides the software is probably the battery life. It's a really good battery life for this type of device. So in terms of those two things, I think these are the best assets for the iPad Air 3 when it comes down to kind of like a functioning standpoint. I think the software is amazing, and I think the battery is also really, really good on this iPad. It's definitely not the best. I think the iPad Pros had really good battery life for the most part too, but this device had killer battery life as well. So in terms of that pretty much covers up, one of my favorite things about this iPad. And to kind of end off with the performance, I mean, this iPad, as I mentioned before, same chipset as the iPhone XS, Apple A12 Bionic chip, hexa-core CPU, and 3 gigabytes of RAM on each of the models that this thing came out with. And as I mentioned before, it's not really a big deal with the RAM too much. I mean, you don't really need a crazy amount of RAM on an iPad or iPhone in order to have a really, really, solid performance from it. In this specific case, I think you're totally okay. I think that was the one thing that really kind of rubbed me the wrong way was the RAM. But as I mentioned, it's really not that big of a deal to me. And I will tell you, going to something like the iPhone 12 that has, more RAM, or the 12 Pro that has more RAM, or the iPad Pros, that's going to give you a better experience overall. But for the value, it's really not that bad. But the chipset inside of it, the A12 Bionic, is still so current, it's so relevant. It's only 2 chipsets behind the current one. And anytime I ever did anything with the iPad Air 3, but on top of that, anytime I do anything with any A12 Bionic chip device, it's solid. I really don't see anything too wrong with it. And if you're doing light apps, perfectly fine. If you're a student and you want to use that Apple, first gen pencil, you can go ahead and use it on this thing and have a really solid experience with it. iPadOS 14 has brought a lot more features than that too. If you're somebody who wants to split screen multitask on your iPad, have your notes on one side while you're taking notes and then reading documents on the other and then highlighting stuff, it's going to be able to do that stuff perfectly fine. Even kind of heavier intensive stuff, like video editing and, photo editing and mild gaming is going to be perfectly fine on this iPad too. So you're really not going to run into any problems of anything that most people are going to do on an everyday basis. But as I mentioned, if you're going to go to a super high intensive type of, use case, if you're split screen multitasking a bunch of different apps at one time, and if you, have a lot of apps in the background, that is where your performance is going to start going down a little bit more. And that's where you may opt in to get something like the iPad Pros or something. But as of right now, I think the iPad Air 3 is still a really decent performing iPad for sure. So that pretty much covers it up there. And to kind of sum up this video and to answer the question, should you go and pick up an iPad Air 3 in 2021? Well, this is what I'll tell you, 100% yes. I think for sure this iPad is a killer iPad, 100%. I mean, it's just, there's really not that much to hate on it. Really there's only really 2 main things I can think of. One, pretty much the body, maybe it's like not the best looking thing compared to like the iPad Air 4. This one does seem to be a little bit outdated, but it's really not that big of a deal to a lot of people. And quite possibly the cameras. I think those 2 things are the things that are probably going to rub people off the wrong way. I think the cameras are okay, but like I said, if you compare them to the newest iPad Pros or even to the newest iPhones or even of the iPhones in 2019, those are going to cause you some kind of, comparison issues. You're going to be like, well, that's not really that great, so maybe I should just go for the iPad Air 4 or something like that. And I would encourage that. I do think the Air 4 is is a much better iPad. It was, I think, the first device with the A14 Bionic chip inside of it, which is so funny. But I think the iPads are great. I think the iPad Air 3 is a really good addition. I love the screen, I love the build quality. I love the performance of this thing, and I love the price tag of this thing. I think those are really strong attributes for something that's not that expensive and it's not a brand new device. So I think it's totally okay. But as I mentioned before, if you want to step it up a notch, it may be better if you go get an iPad Air 4 or something like that. So that really pretty much covers it up. If you guys have any other questions or anything like that, let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. Every single subscriber that we get really does count, so it means so much if you guys can hit that. Also check out the other links down in the description as well. My Twitter, my Instagram, my other channels. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.